In the ruins of a shattered city, silence meant survival. A breath too loud could end a life. A single heartbeat could give you away. From the rubble emerged not wind, not rats, but something far deadlier. Vasily Zaitsev pressed his eye to the scope, watching a German officer adjust his binoculars. 200 meters. The air was still. The routine, predictable. That shot was more than just another kill. It was the moment a shepherd boy from the Urals turned into a legend. In the winter of 1942, his name spread through German bunkers like a shadow, a figure balanced between man and myth. His story was never only about marksmanship, but about what a person becomes when the world collapses, when the only choice left is to endure or to disappear. The trigger moved, the officer fell, and something inside Vasily faded too. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. Before Stalingrad turned him into a phantom, Vasily Zaitsev was simply a boy who understood the language of silence. Born in 1915 in a village so remote that maps barely acknowledged its existence, he grew up where the Ural Mountains met endless forests, where survival meant reading signs others couldn't see. His grandfather's gift changed everything. Not gold or silver, but something far more valuable in those harsh lands. An old hunting rifle, worn smooth by generations of hands, carrying the weight of tradition and the promise of precision. The weapon came with a lesson that would echo through battlefields years later. The old man looked into 12-year-old Vasily's eyes and spoke words that would define a destiny. "A rifle is like truth," his grandfather said. "If you aim it, you cannot hesitate. Otherwise, you lie not only to yourself, but to whatever you're pointing at." Most children would have seen this as a burden. Vasily saw it as a calling. The forests became his classroom, patience his teacher. He learned to become part of the landscape, to breathe with the rhythm of sleeping earth, to move like mist through undergrowth. His prey wasn't the massive bears that other hunters boasted about. He chose the difficult targets, the ones that required absolute precision. Rabbits at 100 paces, birds in flight, creatures whose survival depended on constant vigilance. Each shot had to be perfect because there would be no second chance. The forest taught him that death was never personal, only necessary. A lesson that would serve him when the targets became human. By 15, Vasily could hold his breath until his heartbeat slowed to barely a whisper. He could lie motionless for hours, becoming so still that deer would graze near his position. Local hunters watched in amazement as this quiet boy consistently brought down prey that seasoned men couldn't even spot. "You should go to the front when the time comes," an old huntsman told him after witnessing a particularly impossible shot. "Though I hope that time never comes." But time has its own intentions, and Vasily's talents were too precise for peace. Military service in the Pacific Fleet should have been routine for a young man from the backwoods. Instead, it became graduate school for a future legend. Vasily's instructors noticed something unsettling about the quiet recruit from the Urals. He didn't just hit targets. He studied them. He understood them. He seemed to know where they would be before they moved. Marksmanship scores that broke records, discipline that bordered on the supernatural, a psychological profile that read like a riddle. "Stubborn character, doesn't speak much, deadly accurate," one officer wrote. "Spends excessive time on the shooting range. He's not a soldier. He's a blade, thin and directed." The blade was about to be tested. June 22nd, 1941. The date that shattered peace across the Soviet Union like glass hitting concrete. Germany had torn up their non-aggression pact, and launched the largest military invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa had begun, and suddenly every skill Vasily had learned in the forests of his childhood became a matter of national survival. News reached his unit through crackling radio transmissions that spoke of cities falling, armies retreating, entire fronts collapsing like dominoes. Vasily received the information standing at his post, his face revealing nothing. Only later, alone with his rifle, did he whisper words that sounded like a prayer or a promise. Time to remember how to aim. Something fundamental shifted in him that night. The boy who had hunted for understanding was gone. In his place stood something harder, more focused. The war hadn't just called him to duty. It had awakened something that had been sleeping in his soul since his grandfather first placed that rifle in his hands. As troop trains rolled west toward a front that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere, Vasily sat in a crowded car filled with men trying not to think about what awaited them. He stared through a frosted window at the passing landscape and felt that familiar pre-shot stillness settling over him. The kind of quiet that comes just before the trigger is pulled. The train moved slowly, as if it knew the destination wasn't just the front lines. It was heading toward the heart of hell itself. Stalingrad in September 1942 wasn't a city anymore. It was a wound torn in the earth, breathing smoke instead of air, bleeding oil instead of water. The Volga River that had once carried commerce and dreams now carried corpses and the desperate prayers of a nation fighting for its existence. When Vasily's train finally wheezed to a stop at what remained of the railway station, the first thing that hit him wasn't the sight of destruction. It was the sound. Not explosions or gunfire, but something worse. The city was groaning like a dying animal, every breeze through shattered windows carrying the voice of agony. Buildings stood like broken teeth against a sky permanently stained with smoke. Streets had become canyons of rubble where shadows could hide snipers, artillery spotters, or death itself. Every doorway was a potential tomb. Every window frame a portal to the afterlife. The 6th Army of General Paulus had been grinding through the city for weeks, reducing it to dust and bone. Soviet defenders clung to basements, sewers, and the shells of factories like survivors of a shipwreck clutching debris. This wasn't warfare anymore. It was something new and terrible. Urban combat, where the only rule was that there were no rules. Vasily was assigned to the 104th Rifle Regiment as an experienced soldier with exceptional marksmanship skills. For 23 days, he fought like everyone else. Straight ahead, no subtlety, just the brutal mathematics of attrition. During the day, he fired at anything that moved. At night, he dug trenches and counted the dead. But the city was watching him, learning from him. In the chaos of conventional combat, his unusual talents began to emerge like flowers growing through concrete. While other soldiers sprayed bullets hoping to hit something, Vasily took careful aim and made every shot count. His hands never shook. His eyes remained cold and calculating even when hell was raining around him. The moment that changed everything happened during a firefight at the brick factory. Through a haze of dust and gunpowder, Vasily spotted 4 German soldiers taking cover behind broken machinery. 30 meters away, partially obscured by smoke and debris, they thought they were invisible. 4 shots, 4 bodies, no wasted ammunition, no unnecessary movement. Just precise clinical elimination. His commander watched this display of marksmanship with something approaching awe. After the shooting stopped, he called Vasily over with words that would redirect the course of the entire battle. "You're not assault infantry," the commander said. studying this quiet soldier who killed with the efficiency of a machine. Your shadow. Your job now is hunting. The transition from regular soldier to sniper wasn't just a change in role. It was a transformation of identity. Vasily was given a modified rifle with enhanced optics, a detailed questionnaire about his background, and access to the most dangerous real estate in Stalingrad. The upper floors of bombed-out buildings where death lived in the spaces between heartbeats. His first official target was a German artillery spotter who had been directing fire at a field hospital. For 2 days, this enemy observer had been untouchable, hidden somewhere in the maze of destruction that surrounded the medical facility. Wounded soldiers died not from their injuries, but from shells that fell with surgical precision on the place meant to heal them. Vasily studied the patterns of incoming fire, traced the likely angles, and identified 17 potential positions where the spotter might be hiding. He eliminated them one by one through patient observation until only one remained. A gap in a collapsed wall that provided the perfect view of the hospital while remaining invisible from ground level. The wait lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of absolute stillness in a bombed-out apartment, where family photographs still hung on walls that no longer had roofs. Vasily became part of the debris, breathing so shallowly that dust didn't move around him. His eye never left the scope, even when cramps screamed through his muscles. When the German finally appeared for just 3 seconds to adjust his observation equipment, Vasily was ready. The bullet traveled 200 meters in less time than it takes to blink, entering the target's temple with mathematical precision. The spotter dropped like a marionette with cut strings. The hospital stopped receiving incoming fire immediately. Word of this success spread through the Soviet lines like electricity through wire. Command structures that had been focused on massive frontal assaults suddenly realized they had discovered something new. Not just a sniper, but a surgical instrument capable of removing specific threats with almost supernatural accuracy. Within a week, Vasily had his own small unit and a growing reputation. Enemy officers who had felt safe behind multiple layers of protection began to understand that nowhere was truly secure. Distance meant nothing. Cover was temporary. The only protection was never presenting a target. But with success came visibility, and visibility brought the most dangerous thing of all. Attention from those who understood exactly what kind of threat he represented. As autumn deepened into winter, Vasily realized that individual excellence wasn't enough. One sniper, no matter how skilled, couldn't change the outcome of a battle involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But dozens of snipers, trained in his methods and scattered throughout the city like an invisible network, could transform the entire nature of urban warfare. The idea of a sniper school emerged not from official military doctrine, but from practical necessity. Soviet forces were learning that Stalingrad's rubble-strewn landscape favored defenders who could strike from concealment and disappear before retaliation arrived. Traditional military formations were useless in this environment. What was needed were individuals who could think like hunters, move like ghosts, and kill with the precision of surgical instruments. Vasily's classroom had no walls, sometimes no roof. One day, lessons might be conducted in the basement of a destroyed tram depot where the smell of oil mixed with dried blood. The next day, students would gather in the attic of a bombed school where chalk dust mingled with concrete powder and the ghosts of children's laughter. His students sat on ammunition boxes, broken furniture, and piles of rubble. They listened not like military cadets, but like acolytes receiving sacred knowledge. Because every word Vasily spoke was literally a matter of life and death. Your goal is not to kill, he would tell them in a voice barely above a whisper, "Your goal is to decide." The distinction puzzled new students until they understood the deeper philosophy. A sniper who simply eliminated targets was just another weapon in the arsenal. A sniper who chose when to shoot and when to hold fire, who understood the psychological impact of each bullet, who could read the flow of battle and insert death at precisely the right moment, was something far more valuable. Vasily taught patience above all else. Students who couldn't lie motionless for 6 hours while observing a single window were dismissed. Those who flinched at distant explosions were sent back to regular units. Only individuals who could become part of the landscape, who could control their breathing until their heartbeat was barely detectable, who could fire between the spaces of their own pulse were allowed to continue. Among his most promising students was Tanya Cherkova, a 22-year-old from Siberia, whose quiet demeanor concealed Hunter's instincts as sharp as Vasily's own. Her first official kill was a German observer positioned in the tower of a destroyed grain elevator. The shot required compensating for wind, distance, and the slight movement of the unstable structure. The bullet found its target with textbook precision. After the shot, Tanya began crying. Vasily sat beside her in the rubble, saying nothing for long minutes. Finally, he spoke with a gentleness that surprised those who only knew his reputation. "If you cry, you're still human. The important thing is not to miss the next shot." As Vasily's reputation grew and his students began operating throughout the city, German commanders faced an unprecedented problem. Their officers were disappearing with surgical precision. Artillery spotters, communications specialists, unit commanders all vanishing in seconds, killed by invisible marksmen who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. Reports flowing back to higher command described a new form of psychological warfare. German soldiers had begun to fear showing themselves even briefly. Morale was cracking under the constant threat of sudden death from an unseen enemy. Something had to be done. The response arrived in November in the form of Major Erwin König, a veteran instructor from the Wehrmacht's premier sniper school. His mission was specific and personal: eliminate Vasily Zaitsev. This wasn't just military strategy. It was a matter of restoring German confidence and proving that no Soviet marksman, regardless of skill, could outmatch German precision. König was everything Vasily might have become under different circumstances: patient, calculating, supremely skilled, and utterly ruthless. He had spent years perfecting the art of long-range elimination, teaching others how to kill from distances that rendered them practically invisible. If anyone could match the ghost of Stalingrad, it would be this quiet professional who approached murder with the detachment of a scientist. The duel began without fanfare or formal declaration. It started with German reconnaissance troops, who began disappearing more frequently in a specific sector near the pump station. Then Soviet spotters failed to return from missions in the same area. Bodies were found with single bullet wounds to the head, each shot placed with surgical accuracy. Vasily recognized the signs immediately. Another professional had entered the game. For 3 days, the two men hunted each other through the rubble-strewn landscape of industrial Stalingrad. Each position had to be chosen with absolute care, because a single mistake would be fatal. Every movement had to be calculated, every breath controlled, every heartbeat timed. König proved to be everything intelligence reports had suggested. His camouflage was nearly perfect, his patience unlimited, his marksmanship flawless. When Vasily set up a mannequin to draw fire, the German's bullet struck exactly where a real head would have been. When König attempted to bait his opponent into revealing position, Vasily recognized the trap and waited. The psychological pressure was unlike anything either man had experienced. This wasn't combat against ordinary soldiers who revealed themselves through movement and sound. This was chess played with high-velocity bullets, where each player had to think not just about his next move, but about how his opponent might interpret that move. On the fifth day, Koenig made his only mistake. While adjusting his scope to account for changing light conditions, he allowed sunlight to reflect briefly off his lens. The glint lasted less than a second, but it was enough for someone who had spent years reading the subtlest signs of the forest. Vasily's shot traveled nearly 200 meters through cold December air and found its target with the finality of natural law. When he looked through his scope moments later, he saw Koenig's face, peaceful even in death, as if the German had accepted his fate before the bullet arrived. The duel was over, but something had changed in Vasily as well. This hadn't been about ideology or national defense. It had been about two craftsmen testing their skills against each other, and only chance had determined the winner. Winter in Stalingrad carried the weight of the dead. Snow fell gray instead of white, contaminated by ash and the residue of constant bombardment. It covered the rubble of buildings that had once housed families, settled on the twisted metal of vehicles that had carried dreams, and outlined the frozen forms of those who would never see spring. Vasily moved through this landscape like a figure from ancient mythology, neither fully alive nor completely dead. His body was present, functional, lethal, but something essential had been worn away by months of reducing human beings to problems that required solving through precisely placed bullets. His notebook had become a ledger of ghosts. Names when he knew them, descriptions when he didn't, coordinates when nothing else remained. Some entries were crossed out, some underlined, all carrying the weight of decisions that could never be undone. Each page represented someone who had woken up that morning with plans, fears, hopes, and memories, and ended the day as simply another number in Vasily's accounting of war. The psychological toll of this work was something military planners hadn't anticipated. Traditional soldiers fired into groups of enemies, sharing the moral burden among many triggers pulled and many bullets fired. Snipers carried individual responsibility for each death, saw each target as a distinct human being before reducing them to a corpse. Vasily's students began to understand this burden as they accumulated their own kills. Some adapted, finding ways to compartmentalize the necessary killing from their essential humanity. Others broke under the weight of what they had become, requesting transfers back to regular units where death was more random and less personal. Tanya Cherkova remained one of the strongest, developing her own methods for processing the psychological damage of surgical killing. She and Vasily would sometimes sit together in the ruins, not speaking, just sharing the silence that came with understanding what they had become. "We're not soldiers anymore," she said one evening as they watched snow fall on the skeletal remains of apartment buildings. "We're not even people. We're just eyes attached to rifles." Vasily nodded slowly. "The question is what we become when the shooting stops." But the shooting showed no signs of stopping, and every day brought new targets, new problems to solve, new entries in the ledger of the dead. January 1943 brought news that seemed impossible after months of grinding warfare. The German Sixth Army, once considered unstoppable, was collapsing under the weight of winter, attrition, and Soviet determination. Field Marshal Paulus, who had entered the city confident of quick victory, was now trapped in a shrinking pocket of resistance with supplies running low and escape routes closed. The sight of German prisoners streaming toward Soviet lines was surreal for soldiers who had spent months fighting what seemed like an endless enemy. These weren't the confident invaders who had swept across Europe. They were hollow-eyed men in ragged uniforms stumbling through snow with the defeated posture of those who had seen too much and survived too little. Vasily watched these processions from hidden positions, his rifle still ready but no longer needed. The systematic elimination of officers and specialists had contributed to this collapse, more than official reports would ever acknowledge. By removing key personnel at crucial moments, his network of snipers had disrupted command structures, communications, and morale beyond their actual numbers. But victory in Stalingrad wasn't an ending for Vasily. It was a transition to something more complex and troubling. Military leadership wanted to capitalize on his reputation, using it for propaganda purposes that felt alien to someone whose effectiveness had depended on invisibility. Newspaper articles, radio interviews, public appearances, all the machinery of heroic narrative that transformed individual soldiers into symbols of national triumph. "The ghost of Stalingrad speaks," read headlines that made Vasily cringe with their melodramatic language. Reporters wanted stories of patriotic fervor and righteous anger. What they got was a quiet man who spoke about necessity rather than glory, about precision rather than passion. "I didn't shoot because I hated them," he told one journalist who was clearly disappointed by the response. "I shot because they were in the way of people going home." The propaganda machine needed heroes who fitted established narratives. Vasily was something else entirely. He was evidence of what human beings could become when pushed beyond normal limits, and that wasn't a comfortable truth for anyone to examine too closely. As spring arrived to wash the blood from Stalingrad's stones, Vasily found himself caught between competing versions of his own identity. The official version presented him as a patriotic hero who had single-handedly turned the tide of battle through superior Soviet marksmanship and ideological commitment. The unofficial version, whispered among combat veterans, described something more unsettling: a man who had become so perfectly adapted to killing that he might never fully return to peace. Military command offered him choices that revealed their understanding of his unique position. He could accept promotion to Moscow, teaching sniper techniques in comfortable academies far from active combat. He could remain in the field, training new units for the campaigns that would eventually push German forces back across Europe. Or he could disappear into civilian life with full honors and the gratitude of a nation. None of these options addressed the central question that haunted his quiet moments. What does someone become after they have looked through a rifle scope and seen humanity reduced to targets for hundreds of days? How does a mind that has learned to calculate wind speed, bullet drop, and the precise moment when an enemy's guard is down readjust to peacetime concerns about weather and work schedules? The answer came gradually, through the simple act of continuing to teach. Young soldiers arrived at his improvised schools with the same eager faces he remembered from his own early military training. They wanted to learn not just marksmanship, but the mental discipline that allowed someone to function effectively in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Vasily discovered that sharing his knowledge created a form of redemption. Each student who learned to control their breathing under pressure, who developed the patience to wait hours for the perfect shot, who understood when not to pull the trigger, was carrying forward something valuable from the hell of Stalingrad. "Your rifle is not a weapon," he would tell new classes, using words that had evolved from his grandfather's original lesson. "It's a tool for making decisions. The most important skill is knowing when to decide that someone lives." By 1944, Vasily had trained more than 300 snipers whose effectiveness rippled through Soviet forces advancing across Eastern Europe. His techniques, refined in the rubble of Stalingrad, proved adaptable to forests, farmland, and eventually urban centers in Germany itself. Students who had learned to disappear into destroyed buildings found they could vanish equally well into tree lines and ruined villages. But success in training others also created distance from the immediate experience of combat. Vasily increasingly found himself removed from the direct application of his skills, becoming instead a curator of knowledge about precision killing. This transition brought its own psychological challenges. The intense focus required for sniper work had served as a form of meditation, a way of narrowing consciousness to the essential elements of sight, breath, and timing. Without that focusing mechanism, the broader implications of his wartime actions began to surface in ways that peacetime training couldn't address. Dreams became a persistent problem. Not nightmares exactly, but repetitive scenarios where his scope would settle on targets who looked familiar. Sometimes they were German soldiers he had actually killed, appearing in his sleep with faces more distinct than they had possessed in life. Sometimes they were people he had never seen before, but who seemed to recognize him through the crosshairs. He began keeping a different kind of notebook, recording not targets eliminated, but moments when he had chosen not to shoot. Enemy soldiers who had revealed themselves at the wrong angle for a clean shot. Officers who had ducked back into cover before he could line up properly. Snipers from his own unit who had missed opportunities because they waited for perfect conditions that never arrived. These entries created a parallel ledger of life preserved through inaction. Decisions not to kill that might have been as important as the decisions to eliminate specific threats. Reading through these pages became a form of meditation that helped balance the weight of his more lethal accomplishments. War ended for Vasily Zaitsev not with victory parades or public celebrations, but with the gradual realization that his particular skills were no longer needed. The systematic destruction of German forces eliminated the requirement for surgical precision in eliminating key personnel. Battles became movements of large formations rather than individual duels between hidden marksmen. His final combat assignment involved training Soviet forces preparing for the push into Germany itself. The irony wasn't lost on him that his last teaching position was preparing snipers to operate in the same types of urban environments where German marksmen had once hunted Soviet defenders. The students in these final classes were different from the desperate volunteers he had trained in Stalingrad. These men had volunteered for sniper training as a career advancement opportunity, attracted by the prestige associated with precision marksmanship. They approached the subject with professional interest, rather than the desperate intensity of soldiers fighting for survival. Vasily found himself emphasizing psychological preparation more than technical skills with these peacetime warriors. The ability to hit distant targets could be taught through repetition and practice. The ability to live with the consequences of hitting those targets required different kinds of preparation. After the war ends, he told his final class of students, "You'll discover that the hardest shots are the ones you didn't take. The memories that will keep you awake aren't the enemies you eliminated. They're the moments when you could have shot but chose not to, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if that choice was correct." One student raised his hand with a question that revealed how completely the younger generation misunderstood the nature of what they were learning. "Comrade Zaitsev, when you were fighting in Stalingrad, did you ever feel proud of your accuracy?" The silence that followed this question stretched long enough for everyone in the room to understand that they had ventured into territory their instructor rarely discussed. Finally, Vasily answered with words that ended his teaching career. "Pride is what you feel when you accomplish something difficult by choice. What we did in Stalingrad wasn't choice. It was necessity. And necessity doesn't leave room for pride, only for consequences." Post-war life for Vasily Zaitsev resembled a reverse metamorphosis. The ghost who had moved invisibly through Stalingrad's ruins gradually became solid again. developing the ordinary concerns of civilian existence: work, family, the daily routines that occupy peacetime consciousness. But the transformation was never complete. Military authorities offered him various positions that would utilize his expertise without requiring active combat. Instructor positions at military academies, consulting roles in developing sniper equipment, administrative work overseeing marksmanship programs throughout the Soviet Union. Each opportunity represented recognition of his unique qualifications, while acknowledging that his most specialized skills were no longer needed. He accepted a teaching position that allowed him to pass along technical knowledge while avoiding the psychological complexities of training people to kill. Mathematics of ballistics, physics of projectile flight, engineering principles involved in rifle accuracy. These subjects provided a way to share practical information without delving into the emotional reality of applying that information against human targets. Students in these peacetime classes approached sniper training as an intellectual exercise rather than preparation for lethal application. They calculated bullet trajectories as abstract problems, practiced breathing techniques as meditation exercises, and learned camouflage as camping skills. The deadly serious intensity of wartime training was replaced by academic interest in precision shooting as a technical discipline. But occasionally, usually in private conversations after formal classes ended, students would ask questions that revealed their understanding that their instructor had experience beyond textbook knowledge. These moments required careful navigation between useful information and psychological territory that was better left unexplored. "Did you ever miss?" a young cadet asked one afternoon as Vasily was cleaning rifles after a practice session. The question seemed simple enough to answer with technical information about environmental factors that could affect accuracy. Wind conditions, temperature variations, mechanical limitations of equipment, human factors like fatigue or stress. But the student was really asking something else, something about the psychological impact of failure when failure meant allowing an enemy to continue threatening friendly forces. "Missing wasn't the problem," Vasily eventually answered. "The problem was hitting when you weren't sure you should." In his later years, Vasily began writing about his experiences with the careful precision he had once applied to long-range marksmanship. Not memoirs in the conventional sense, but analytical examinations of how human beings adapt to extreme circumstances and what psychological tools allow individuals to function effectively under conditions that would normally paralyze consciousness. His approach to this writing reflected the same methodical thinking that had made him effective in combat. Each chapter examined specific aspects of psychological adaptation: how to maintain emotional stability while making life or death decisions repeatedly, techniques for processing the moral complexity of necessary killing, methods for preserving essential humanity while developing the mental hardness required for survival in extreme situations. The resulting book became required reading in military psychology programs, not because it glorified combat, but because it provided unprecedented insight into the internal experience of individuals who had been pushed far beyond normal human limits and found ways to remain functional. Medical professionals studying post-traumatic stress found his descriptions of adaptation mechanisms valuable for understanding both resilience and breakdown under extreme pressure. But the most significant aspect of his writing was what it revealed about the long-term psychological costs of wartime survival. Vasily described the experience of returning to civilian life as similar to reverse culture shock, where ordinary peacetime concerns seemed simultaneously trivial and overwhelming after years of existence reduced to essential survival calculations. "The hardest part of peace," he wrote, "isn't learning to stop killing. It's learning to care about things that don't directly threaten survival." When every decision for years has been about staying alive for the next few minutes, planning for next week becomes an abstract exercise. This insight into the disconnect between wartime and peacetime consciousness became influential in developing support programs for combat veterans across multiple generations of conflicts. Military psychologists began understanding that successful warriors often struggled with civilian reintegration, not because they were damaged by combat, but because they had become perfectly adapted to conditions that no longer existed. Vasily Zaitsev died in 1991, just as the Soviet Union that had shaped his life was dissolving into something unrecognizable. His final years were spent not as a celebrated war hero, but as a quiet man who occasionally spoke to historians about experiences that seemed increasingly distant from contemporary reality. The Cold War had ended without the nuclear confrontation that many had expected, making his expertise in precision elimination seem like a relic from a more primitive era of warfare. Younger military professionals were more interested in electronic warfare, guided missiles, and satellite surveillance than the patient craftsmanship of individual marksmanship. But his legacy extended beyond military applications. The psychological techniques he had developed for maintaining focus under extreme pressure found applications in fields ranging from emergency medicine to competitive athletics. His methods for controlling physiological responses to stress became part of training programs for surgeons, police officers, and anyone else whose profession required peak performance under life or death pressure. The notebooks he had kept throughout his military career became historical documents that provided unprecedented insight into the internal experience of combat. Unlike official military records that focused on tactical outcomes and strategic objectives, his personal writings revealed the human cost of warfare, measured not in casualties and territory, but in psychological adaptation and moral complexity. Historians studying his records discovered that his most significant contribution wasn't his individual kill count, or even his role in training other snipers. It was his development of psychological frameworks that allowed ordinary human beings to function effectively in circumstances that should have been psychologically overwhelming. His final notebook entry, written shortly before his death, provided a summation of everything he had learned about the relationship between necessity and choice, survival and humanity, precision and conscience. "I became what the war required me to become," he wrote. "The question that matters isn't whether that transformation was right or wrong. The question is whether it was temporary or permanent, whether the person who emerges from such experiences can find their way back to caring about life instead of death. In the end, the most important shot is always the one you don't take." The notebook closed on a life that had begun in forests where silence meant survival, and ended in a world where the skills he had perfected were no longer needed. But the questions he had raised about human adaptation, moral responsibility, and the psychological costs of necessary violence continued to echo through military academies, medical schools, and anywhere else people needed to understand what happens when ordinary individuals are pushed beyond the normal limits of human experience. His grave in a Moscow cemetery bears a simple inscription that would have satisfied the practical man who had lived through the siege of Stalingrad and emerged with his essential humanity intact, despite everything he had been required to do in service of survival. He aimed true. He chose well. He came home. The final lesson of Vasily Zaitsev's life wasn't about marksmanship or military tactics. It was about the possibility of retaining moral awareness, even while engaging in activities that might seem to require its suspension. About finding ways to preserve what makes us human, even when circumstances demand behaviors that feel inhuman. about the difference between becoming what survival requires and losing what survival is meant to protect. In the end, perhaps that distinction was his greatest victory. Not the battles won through precise shooting, but the internal battle to remain a person worth saving even while saving others through the most extreme methods imaginable. The ghost of Stalingrad had finally found peace, not through forgetting what he had done, but through understanding why it had been necessary and what it had protected. The silence he had learned in those frozen ruins wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibilities that existed because he had been willing to do what was required when requirements had been absolute. The last echo of his rifle had finally faded, replaced by something quieter but more durable. The knowledge that even in humanity's darkest moments, the capacity for moral choice survives if we have the courage to exercise it.